Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Hello and welcome, listeners, to the Prose and Cons podcast. This is a writing podcast where sometimes we feel like prose and sometimes we feel like cons. With me today is Paddy Boylan and James Healy. Paddy?
Hi, I'm Paddy Boylan. I am a technical writer, writing teacher, and editor. And sometimes I find the time to write fiction.
Cool. James?
I'm James Healy. I'm an editor and a writer of horror and science fiction.
And my name is Alex. I am also a writer. I've published a collection of short horror stories. Very recently, I was published in the fiction edition of the Big Issue, which I've been crying about for weeks. So today, we're going to discuss a topic that's very close to my heart. We're going to be discussing cosmic horror. Now, you might have heard of this described as Lovecraftian horror. I don't really want to use that terminology for reasons I'll get into later. But basically, I'm talking about things that were fundamentally formed from H.P. Lovecraft's kind of vision of how things are horrific. So, for example, a gigantic existential threat that essentially sort of threatens humanity or threatens just an individual. Yeah, so before we get into it, can you guys tell me what you've been reading? Paddy, what have you been going through or viewing or playing?
Still reading Robert Harris's Imperium, which is set in the Fall of the Roman Republic, historical fiction, very interesting. I'm watching The Wire, which is, if I could give it more than 5 stars out of 5, I would. It's absolutely top-notch viewing. The Wire, very, very good crime drama.
Nice. How about you, James? What have you been consuming?
Literally nothing that I can think of this week.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah. That's right. It's okay, cool. And I've finished Tomorrow, and that's by Gabrielle Zevin. Basically, it's about these two video game designers. They meet as kids, they bond over playing like Mario, and it just follows their lives creating this video game company together, and the various pitfalls and relationship traps that sort of come from that, and how they use video games as a medium to explore themselves through that. And it's really, really good. It's one of the best books. It's definitely one of the best books I've read this year. It might be a top 10 of books I've read. I think it's very good. So I thoroughly recommend it. Cosmic horror. You know what? I'm actually just going to read off this little thing that I put up myself.
Read the shit out of it.
Yeah. So yeah, it derives its horror predominantly from its perspective. So good cosmic horror sets a trap as appearing to be one thing, maybe a creepy town, a haunted castle, etc., but then jars us into disorientation by revealing a much greater scope, as implied in the name. You might also hear this referred to as oceanic horror, things from the deep and dark, but we're just going to use this as a catch-all. The threat is much bigger and more reality-breaking, and that's really crucial, the reality-breakingness of it, than you first thought, and the horror is seeded through those elements. I'm going to give you guys a bit of an analogy. I'm sure everyone's familiar with it, but I just think this might give a good literalized example of kind of how this stuff works.
Is it the ant crawling over the computer?
Yeah, that's actually not an awful analogy either.
Okay, because I got another one.
But yeah, more or less. So let's say you're walking along and you see a cave, and you're feeling adventurous, so you decide to explore it. The cave starts really wide at first, but after a while it begins to narrow down and down. It's getting thinner and thinner. So you soon realize you don't have room to turn around, and the cave keeps narrowing and narrowing. Soon it's so tight that it's constricting your breathing. This is the horror element, the slow ratcheting of tension, and there's plenty of places to take that. You can go anywhere with that, essentially. But cosmic horror, an example of cosmic horror would be if suddenly that cave opens up and you kind of look out onto this vista and you can see two giants. And those giants are so big that you can't even see their heads through the clouds, and they're throwing giant boulders at each other. And they don't even necessarily see you there. It's this sudden big reframe of perspective, making the view of the reader recalculate where the protagonist even is in the world. So that's quite a literal example, but I think it's sort of the recontextualization is a big thing. Like you think it's one thing, and then it kind of broadens out to this whole other thing that's vast in scope and is really kind of horrific. Cool. So yeah, I'll throw it over to you guys. In terms of cosmic horror, what is your sort of experience with it? What's your understanding of it? I'll throw it to you first, James, because I know that you're pretty well versed in this stuff.
Yeah, so I guess my interpretation of cosmic horror would sort of be like, and I guess this is more taking it from the perspective of, I guess, following on from Lovecraft. So I don't really know in what avenues it's gone in kind of more modern stories. But I definitely think it's the idea of taking the unknown and then almost scienceifying it, or kind of almost modernizing it a little bit beyond the supernatural, or I guess it being related to, because I guess all of the stories that are about ghosts and are about the darkness and other things like that were often based in the fact that we hadn't figured certain things out and that we hadn't really explored that much of our world. So I guess cosmic horror kind of came into it around the 1950s when we sort of had figured out a lot of things. So I do feel like it's an element of taking the supernatural and basing it in, saying, well, these things are actually stuff that we just haven't figured out yet, or they've come in from outside, maybe from outer space, from some other dimension or some other even plane. So I think it's an element of, yeah, kind of just taking, like you were saying, the perspective as just being something which is limited, that is kind of getting a look into something which is much larger, but beyond our comprehension. So it is kind of, it is just something very existential about it, because it takes the perspective that humanity is very, very meaningless in the grand scope of things. And the stories tend to, when they reach into that place, it comes with it a great sense of like existential horror and kind of almost meaninglessness about kind of humanity's place in the world.
It's quite nihilistic.
And I guess they're very nihilistic as well. And then I guess there are just a few kind of tropes that go along with that, where there's often isolation, people being detached from their surroundings, or detached from what they knew, and a little bit of there's always sanity. Sanity is always on the cusp of being destroyed, because this realization is so harrowing to the characters. I think that'd be my basic understanding of it.
Distinct.
Yeah. No, it's very broad, the things it covers. Like there's this subset of things that are within it that are identifiable, but to sort of encapsulate it all is kind of hard to do. And I think you did put that pretty well there. What about you, Patty? How are you? What's your familiarity with this?
So I mentioned the ant on the computer thing. A little while ago, I was on Reddit, and someone made a post about how they're frustrated with how often cosmic horror is done badly. Because if anyone's familiar with like the trappings of it all, I mentioned tentacles, haha. But seriously, there's so many, like, especially video games right now. Like cosmic horror is really big right now, and they're trying to plug into the whole cosmic horror thing, but without giving that full sense of like cosmic scale and dread, and we cannot know the universe and it's all meaningless. Instead, they go for the trappings, like the creature rising out of the sea with tentacles on its face, or the person going mad and writing on all their walls and drawing like occult symbols, and all that stuff is just, I mean, it's like the reason that Halloween decorations aren't scary. It's like all the trappings are scary, but it's missing the point. It's not horror because it's not engaging us emotionally. So anyway, the ant on the computer thing, just quickly, they were saying like this is to them cosmic horror. Imagine you've got an ant, and the ant is like, it doesn't know anything, and it's crawling across a computer, and suddenly it gets in its tiny ant mind like a sense of the internet and the broad, incredibly expansive scope of the internet, like the sum of human knowledge, war, politics, economics, chemistry, nuclear war, astrophysics. And then that information's gone and it's still an ant. Like, what does the ant do with that? How can it begin to understand that? What does it go back when it goes like to the nest, and how does it even begin to communicate that with its ant bodies? They were saying that's cosmic horror, and I think there's something to that. It's when we're confronted with something that's actually just beyond us and makes us face the fact that we're very, very tiny.
Yeah, and I think you've really hit on something there that is, for me, sort of front of mind when I think of cosmic horror, and that is this sense of unknowability, and the fact that it's like a character will be walking along and then they'll be confronted with something over the course of a short story or of a novel. It's my opinion that this actually works better in a shorter form generally. But basically, they'll be confronted with this great knowledge of something that is so much greater than them, and they can't even really conceive of. And that isn't limited to a concept. That could just be like something that is so well. The trope is like it was indescribably hideous or horrific, which sounds silly and tacky when you think about it. But if you like think of sort of seeing there's that idea, I forget where it comes from, the idea that like if you were to see God, if you were to see the idea of God, it would be so mind-shatteringly, mind-bendingly shocking that witnessing the divinity, that it would basically destroy you by just the act of conceiving of it. You know,
the short film Pi got into that. I know you didn't like that short film. James,
I actually didn't. I don't think I watched all of it, to be honest.
Okay.
I didn't get to the end of it.
Have you ever heard of this film?
The time travel one?
No, it's not dissimilar. Short story. Mathematician begins to think he sees like the work of God in mathematics. Kind of gets a glimpse of God in the infinite. Nearly loses his mind. Manages to pull back from the brink. Never does mathematics again.
Math is a hell of a drug.
Yeah.
That'll be the subtitle for the episode. But this is actually something that really interests me, and it's something I got into a little bit on the last episode. I think you were there, Patty, when I was talking about the Stephen King horror story, and I think I will actually read a bit of this later, just to give a sense of what it is. But that sense of just like when you're in it and you're seeing it happen to you, it's just so expansive that you can't even conceive it. And that's a really fun idea to play with in literature, right? Like, so another aspect of that, of the unknowability of things, is the infinite possibilities that you can do with that as a writer. So we're fiction writers, right? We write things, and theoretically we can write whatever we want, right? But within the framework of any given story, let's say romance. Let's say a romance story. You know that these two people are going to meet. They're going to have some sort of connection. There's probably going to be a falling out, and they're going to ultimately reunite or maybe fall apart tragically. But there's a set progression on that. I feel like with existential horror, cosmic horror, the things that can actually happen in that, and the way you can conceive of horror, of something horrific happening, the possibilities for how to convey that are like almost literally limitless. There's this freedom to play around in that.
At the same time, I would actually say that they're very limited. And I think because, it's really hard to do well. Yeah, you can go to some really weird places with it, but there's so many ways to do it badly. And the thing you choose has to be so specific in what it evokes and what it does in the story, that even though the potential spaces is really big, it's almost like, but the spaces you kind of can't go or shouldn't go, I would say, are even bigger.
I think the main issue with, like you were saying, Paddy, with people trying to copy cosmic horror, people trying to write cosmic horror, is that they tend to copy Lovecraft, which is a mistake, because, like Alex, you were saying, I think Stephen King does cosmic horror really well, specifically because he's not doing cosmic horror. He's writing his own story, and it is its own thing, but it can have elements of cosmic horror in it. Alex, you brought up the story where the character goes into a room. I can't,
Yeah,
1406,
1408,
1408.
1408, yeah. If you
Great
add
cosmic
the
horror.
numbers up, they get to 13, which is kind of cute little touch.
Okay, that's great cosmic horror because it's based in this other thing, but it brings cosmic horror into it. The story It is also like, that's such a cosmic horror story,
It's
but
literal
it's based
cosmic horror,
on
yeah.
all these other things that are very, very, very Stephen King. So he's like telling his own story, but bringing elements into it.
It only turns into cosmic horror at the end, right? I haven't read it.
Sort
I
of.
guess
Okay.
the lore and the background that you learn, which, so I don't want to get into it because it's spoiler, but it
Yeah.
involves it involves so many elements that you would typically see in a Lovecraftian type story or a cosmic horror story. But he's told his own story throughout that. He's based it in something, but he's told it his own way. And I think that's the best thing that you can do is, if you have an understanding of if you're playing with that cosmic horror universe, tell your own story within that, and you can try to employ certain things. And like Alex, you're saying, go in any direction, because it's really boundless what you can do. But if you're trying to specifically copy like a cosmic horror thing, if that's what you set out to do, but you don't have, I don't know how to say it. It's almost like if you've researched, if you're world building and you know your world so well, you can tell the story whatever way you want because you understand that's how the world works. But if you're coming in and you're trying to copy someone else's world because you've read it and you like it and you're trying to write something similar, it's gonna fall down, it's gonna ring hollow. And I think that's what a lot of like badly done cosmic horror ends up doing. When H.P. Lovecraft tells a story, he kind of introduces the fact that the characters have fallen afoul of beings or some kind of creature which is beyond our comprehension, or their technology is beyond our understanding. And then towards the end of the story, he just introduces some horrific lost state that the characters could end up in, which it's really exaggerated, but it feels totally normal because you've already established that we are ants to these things, and whatever torture they choose to do to us is beyond our mortal understanding. So it seems so much worse in the story. And that's just because he was just writing it as it made sense to him because he understood it so well. So it works in that sense.
Yeah, it's that sense of the map is not the territory. You know, that's a phrase that I think we should use more often. Like the map is not the territory. So it's the idea that if you're like, it's hard to explain, but basically the idea is like you're looking at a map and you're like, oh, that's like there's an apple tree over there. That's the apple tree. And it's like, no, that's not the apple tree. That is a representation.
It's a thin like facsimile of a deeper thing. Yeah.
Like the
much like reality in the Lovecraftian cosmic horror story.
The Lovecraftian universe is basically like his extrapolation of that central tenet. It's him going to the myth pool, and then taking it in his own direction from there, which is the key thing. Like tentacles aren't, that's not what like Lovecraftian or cosmic horror is about, really. Tentacles are a synecdoche for they represent the idea of infinite unknowability and all that sort of stuff.
I would also, I really feel like he doesn't write about tentacles that much. Like,
no, he doesn't.
I'm pretty sure Cthulhu is the only monster he has that has tentacles.
The legacy of Lovecraft is its own thing that is not Lovecraft.
Every time Lovecraft is brought up, there's some kind of artist interpretation of Cthulhu. So it looks like his stories are just full of monsters with tentacles. When
just quickly, before you come in, I know you want to come in, Alex, but I was reading a little bit about Lovecraft a while ago. He was writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That was also a time when a lot of deep sea exploration was happening for the first time. And he was interested in naturalism. So he's getting all these old daguerreotypes and like early pictures of these, kind of horrors from the sea, right? Like the sea is, it's hard to imagine that didn't inspire his work somehow. Like this is a completely alien environment. We've never seen anything like this before.
Yeah. He wrote a number of stories about fish people, which I feel is more a thing for him than writing about tentacles.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. The Shadow of the Innsmouth is in many ways like the I think it's kind of the definitive Lovecraft work in a way. But the Cthulhu mythos just took it. That's only 3 stories, the Cthulhu mythos, I believe. There might be more. There's Dagon and stuff, and a few things worked into it. I do want to dive into another element of it though, and you guys briefly mentioned it though. I've written it down here as the imprecation of madness, which I think is just a great phrase.
Like a death metal band name.
Yeah, imprecation of madness. Yeah, but the idea that somehow this thing is linked to going mad, and we've already talked about that a little bit in terms of it, like, oh, it's so big that it's sending me insane. But I don't know, how do you guys think the theme of madness is threaded through this genre and this idea?
How is it threaded through? Commonly, I mean, it makes.
Okay. What about so you've read the 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, right?
Yes.
I would say that's pretty definitively cosmic horror in its own way.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
For sure. Yeah, I'm like, it's obvious to me, like, James and Alex, you know a lot more about horror than me, but madness is if a lot of horror is like threat to the body, then cosmic horror is threat to the mind or the psyche. So insanity and the threat of sanity is like, that's the stakes. That's what's at stake, is the mind. So I mean, it makes sense that insanity would be the thing that goes wrong. However, having said that, I've read a bunch of things. Alex, we were talking just before that, as I said, I've actually never read any cosmic horror, but I have. Like you mentioned, the 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch.
Yeah.
James, you ever heard of that?
No, I haven't. No.
It's a Philip K. Dick story. Just fucking weird, really weird. Like,
strange.
Okay.
Yeah, space and the divine, and it gets great story. Also, okay, spoilers for the 3 Body Problem series. 3, 2, 1.
I was going to bring up the 3 Body Problem.
Okay, sorry, I'm getting in there first.
I haven't read the 3rd book, so if you can give spoilers doing the 3rd.
No, I can't.
Yeah, don't do it to me.
It starts on Earth. I'll just say this, and it's a sci-fi story, a really, really good one. Chinese author, actually. And the scope gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it gets more and more like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I don't think there's any characters going insane, but you as the reader, there are these moments where you go, oh shit, that could actually be possible. Oh shit, that could actually be possible. And it's almost that sense of the floor falling away from you as you realize, like, just how big and cruel and strange the universe could potentially be. That's all I'll say. So insanity, don't think it has to play a part, but it makes sense that it would.
That scene in the dark forest where the character explains the dark forest concept and he has a cigarette.
Yeah,
that for sure is cosmic horror. That the sense that gives you when you're reading it, that existential terror.
Is the tip of the iceberg for what comes after it in the 3rd book. It gets crazy. Yeah, and then the 3rd book is really,
man, I really want to read this now.
Yeah,
it's so good. They're making a series of it, which
they've made 2. There's a Chinese one and a Netflix one. Like the Netflix one is, I think it's in production. Okay. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But the Chinese one is already out. So there's already, like, it's on YouTube. You can watch it. I haven't, but I've been told.
Very exciting. Very exciting. It won't be a productive day for James.
Yeah,
that's cool.
So
I'll just jump in on that. Just on that point on insanity. Sorry, what was the question originally?
Talking about like madness, basically, just like how madness.
I think that in terms of horror, I think the idea of like Paddy was saying, losing your mind is almost just another element to the threat. And I think that the idea of losing your sanity, or if you want to step into kind of like losing your soul kind of thing.
Yeah.
That
losing yourself, like this sense of your identity.
Even self, but it's more like harm to the body is it's a threat that only goes so far. Whereas losing your sanity feels like it's a total destruction of everything. It's almost like a death in itself.
I think that means like the sense of self, right? So
not like losing sanity, the sense of self, or losing your soul, if you believe in a soul, believing that, because I think there's a couple of stories where the characters come to understand otherworldly things, and then the threat is not just being killed, but it's like being taken away and your soul being eaten or something like that, which is almost like stepping up to a different level of horror. It's like, you could die, but that's okay because that's the natural course of things. But now you've stepped into somewhere where the natural course of things won't go the way it's supposed to. And the idea of meeting something that is like, oh, if I kill you, I'll take you, like hell is real and I'll take you there. That kind of idea.
Yeah. That's
it hits in a different place. Like,
yeah.
It's like, have you guys ever not to get too sordid here, but have you guys ever, like, okay, we've all smoked weed, right? Have you guys ever had the experience of like greening out, like, and going into basically like a panic state? Like,
yes.
That to me is like the and Stephen King actually explains it that way in the short story. Like it's like the feeling of like cheap weed, that like paranoia of like, oh no, I'm going down the hole, I'm going all the way down, and there's nothing that can save me. Like something is like broken. Do you know what I mean? Maybe that's just the me thing, but that feeling, it feels very well threaded through through cosmic horror.
Yeah,
I've had a bad hallucinogenic trip where I was under the impression I had been taken away from everything I knew, and held in a confined space for thousands and thousands of years. Which is really not a nice feeling.
That wasn't worth $20.
Hey,
that wasn't worth $20.
That wasn't a good time. But the relief when I came out of that was quite nice. But yeah, no, I think the stories that kind of evoke cosmic horror, and I'm thinking kind of even of the early ones that would have inspired Lovecraft and kind of the Yellow King and the Willows as well. Like the Willows, the idea of insanity is tied into like even just the geography of that story. Like the characters are on a small island in the middle of a rushing river, and as the story goes on, the river is sort of knocking bits of the island off, so the island is getting smaller and smaller, and that works as an analogy for the character's sanity eroding away as he spends contacts with this realization that he doesn't want the grasp because it will drive him mad. And that context and the way that all of that works, I don't think it necessarily has to be in a cosmic horror story. But I think that you'd be missing a massive trick if you didn't put it in. And I feel like it almost works better if the characters are just handling the realization. I think that it's harder to make it hit the reader. Like you kind of want to put the reader in the character's shoes as much as possible. So the character should be really affected by what they're learning or what they're experiencing.
Yeah, and that's the horror side, right? It's like feeling that terror.
And that's a horror trope in any sense. That sense of like it can almost be a cheap trick, you know, the like when the reveal starts happening to the character being like, oh, is this real? Am I going mad? You know, and I find that can be very, very overused. Recently, I read a story where I was like, this feels like a bit of a cliche at this point, but it certainly can.
Yeah, it needs to be well done, I think.
Yeah,
like
that's when you were talking before, James, about like just how cliched so many of Lovecraft's kind of tropes have become. It's even funny when it comes to cosmic horror, which relies entirely on it being the unknown and the fear of the unknown and the fear of encountering something you've never encountered before. And you reach a point when you're in the Steam library and you're browsing Steam games and there's another Eldritch horror game. And it's like, but I've seen the tentacle monsters. I know there's unfathomable horror. Like I know that there's creations beyond God's writ. It's like entirely known at this point. It's kind of like, it's kind of tragic.
Yeah.
I think it has to hit you in a new way. Like the Dark Forest hits you with a new angle on that. You know what I mean? I think that's the way it has to be done. Or even I know you guys have probably heard of that video game Subnautica.
Yep.
No, you're thinking of Soma.
No. I think it's called Subnautica. Your spaceship has landed on a water planet.
Yeah, it's great. It's scary at times.
Is Soma not the one where people are in computers?
Yes. Sorry, I thought you were talking about that.
No, not that one. Although that one is very good. Very, very good. But I'm thinking of Subnautica, which I think your spaceship has landed in the sea, on some other planet.
Yeah.
And you're sort of swimming around and then later on motorboating around or something and trying to just gather resources. But every now and again, as you plummet into the depths, you come across larger and larger fish things.
Yeah. And you go deeper and deeper into the depths.
Yeah, that idea of seeing something moving through the water and then kind of realizing how big that is something that hits you with that sense of oh god, it
really
gets
does.
deeper, or they get bigger.
Yeah.
That
That's
works
it.
quite
It's
well.
the sense of this goes deeper. There is more to this. Oh my God, this is awful, but it gets worse. That's a big thing too.
There's a
I
really good. Sorry, I just one more thing.
go on,
There's an
go on.
amazing video essay. I forget the guy's name, but he does a lot of good video essays, and it's called "Fear of Depths," and it deals with all of this: the fear of the deep and the fear of how big things can get in the deep, and how small you are when surrounded by an environment with no landscape features.
Yeah.
That's all worth checking out.
Yeah. No, we can put that in the show notes. Actually, I'd like to see that. I think I want to read out this story. Like not all of it. It's a really long story, really long, really great story. But I want to read out the part where it actually kicks in and the horror really starts horroring. And this is 1408. So spoilers for anyone who hasn't done it. There's not actually really any spoilers in here. It's more just like. Horror is really all about tension, and this is just masterful tension building. So I'm gonna read this out. So this is from 1408 by Stephen King. This is like pretty deep into it. So that all the beginning stuff has happened. I'm just gonna read it out as it goes. So Mike blundered towards the door, his feet smooching and now actually seeming to stick a little at each step. The door wouldn't open, of course. The chain hung unengaged. The thumb bolt stood straight up like a clock, hands pointing to 6 o'clock. But the door wouldn't open. Breathing rapidly, Mike turned from it and waited, that's what it felt like, across the room to the writing desk. He could see the curtains beyond the window he'd cracked open, waving desultorily. But he could feel no fresh air against his face. It was as though the room was swallowing it. He could still hear horns on Fifth, but now they were very distant. Did he still hear the saxophone? If so, the room had stolen its sweetness and melody and left only an atonal, reedy drone, like the wind blowing across a hole in a dead man's neck or a pop bottle filled with severed fingers. And there's more of it, obviously, but I just wanted to read that.
Filled with severed fingers.
It's just such a creepy, creepy thing there.
That's really good. He really, I like the idea of the music sounding atonal. Something about that is distinctly off-putting.
Yeah. The whole thing is like that. That's really just a random selection almost. Like it's where it starts to really kick in. But it's just it's one of my favorites. Like cosmic horror sort of things. I really recommend listening to the audiobook if you can. So that's really good.
So there's a science fiction author called Ian M. Banks who does a series called The Culture. To be honest, I've only read one book of it and I didn't love it, but I hear his stuff is great and I feel like I should like it.
Which one was it? Can I ask?
Use of Weapons.
Oh, I read Player of Games. That was fucking great.
Yeah, I hear Player of Games is really good. He plays with big ideas and I love ideas. That's why science fiction is great. He invented this concept, or at least he gave name to it. It's the outside context problem. Have you guys ever heard of this?
No.
I really like the space where cosmic horror and science fiction meet. I mean, you're talking about like cosmic, it's space. The cosmic horror doesn't necessarily have to be science fiction related, but to me, there's a place where cosmic horror becomes quite real when we start to think about what could potentially be out there in reality that we haven't experienced. He describes an outside context problem as it's an existential threat to a civilization, but it's not that they can't deal with it necessarily, that they haven't even imagined that it could be a thing. They haven't even imagined that something like this is even possible. It's completely outside of the context of their understanding. It would be like, let's say we think about like alien invasion tropes today, and that'd be pretty scary, but we've all got an idea of like what an alien invasion would be like. What would that be like to the people of like, let's say, medieval Europe? They hadn't even thought about aliens. They've got no context with which to understand this, like no grounding whatsoever.
Well, I guess they were thinking it was gods or something.
Yeah,
I guess so. Yeah,
that'd be the quickest way for them to try to understand that or figure that one out.
I suppose it would be. You'd have to grasp at something. But anyway, his point is like an outside context problem is usually something the civilization only encounters once, and then they don't encounter anything ever again. Often. fun idea.
Depending on
and-
the aliens, you know.
Yeah, well,
Depending on who the aliens
not even
are.
necessarily aliens. It could be like a fluke of physics that ends up making like I don't know. I can't imagine what an outside context problem would be. But I feel like
Yeah.
that is
That is-
very cosmic horror.
Yeah, I like
Yeah.
that. That is something I've played with in a short story I'm writing at the moment.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, humanity discovers something or kind of discovers proof of something, which is pretty great. And then we almost immediately break it and start to really fuck things up.
Can I read that?
So
That
it's kind of
sounds
a
great.
yeah. I'm hoping it lands in the way that I wanted to.
Okay,
'cause
that's
on
right
the
in my
one hand,
wheelhouse.
just guess there's two hits. There's the hit of like, oh, this is a thing, and then there's the hit of like something's happening now, and then it's like, oh, we broke the thing, and now it's all unraveling.
Nice.
Run.
Yeah. I've never heard of it before. I thought a little bit about like divine horror. Is that a thing?
Yeah.
Because it should be.
Well, I mean,
like
the nature of horror is like cosmic horror is like elder gods, right? Like however you want to think about it. And I'm not saying any specific elder gods, but like something that is greater than yourself imposing its will on you, either knowingly or unknowingly. So yeah, I guess inherently it's divine.
yeah, and I guess all of the old Greek stories of the gods coming in and
Yeah.
either intentionally out of meanness or just out of callousness and boredom.
But
boredom.
they
Bit of-
are a little bit more known, aren't they? Like people had ideas of what they thought, Zeus would do. Like Zeus would transform himself into a ram and like come down and like have sex with a bunch
Just
of
be
people.
a terrible person, basically.
Just be a terrible.
Yeah.
And they're terrible people.
No.
Like they're all just horrible people. So it's like if you think this is the high watermark of like your gods, like Jesus, how depraved must the ancient Greeks have been? No, that's probably an unfair extrapolation, but it is interesting that it's interesting they chose to represent them in that way as opposed to the way that we do it now in terms of Judeo-Christian God, where it's like, no, he's great, like he's just the best. Even when he's kind of a dick, he's still the best.
I don't think they were moral peaks to look up to, I think is the difference. They were just like, yeah, the gods are just there and they do all sorts of weird shit.
Yeah.
They're basically just like people with loads of power.
Yeah.
Really misuse it.
Yeah, because now we have Elon Musk.
Yes. Cool. So let's have a look at how we might sort of apply some lessons about what makes cosmic horror good and, specifically what makes it not good. I feel like we've talked about a little bit of that as to how to apply that to our own writing if we do want to write something in that vein. If someone listening's like, I'd like to try my hand at writing cosmic horror, what's some ways that or some frameworks we could think of to be able to start doing that? James, what do you reckon?
I think probably my biggest piece of advice would be to don't focus on the beat of the story where the character realizes the thing and goes insane. Focus on the world. Focus on the thing that they come to understand, because you can control how the character learns what they learn and how big a part that plays in the story. But in order to make that land, I think you need to understand the fabric of the reality that you're creating. I think the stronger an understanding you have of that, the more you can come back to that well again and again and again and change the way in which the characters encounter it and realize how that works. And I genuinely think that you can tell the same story multiple times because you're changing the perspective and changing the flow of how it's discovered. And if you do it correctly, you'll get that same kind of existential horror when the characters discover it. So that's where you want to start. You want to start by developing something that you understand very well. And it doesn't have to be something that will definitely drive people crazy. You control the story. You control the mindset of the character walking into this understanding. Through your telling of what it is going to be the thing that creates the horror. So my advice would just be to just do a really good job at world building.
Nice. Yeah. What do you reckon, Patty?
I teach creative writing to kids, and I'm often talking these days about interiority, which is it's so important to not just say what happens to the character, but let's jump into the character for a second and show how they're reacting and show their inner experience to it. If you do write insanity, don't just describe from the outside how they're going insane. Don't just tell us they're going insane. Take a moment to stop and think about what it would actually, what the sensations of it would be like of experiencing this unknowable massive thing. That's going to make it hit so much harder. If you can find ways to describe the sensations and the experience and the inner world at that moment, rather than just saying, and they went insane.
Yeah. And I think I would say, I know I talked a lot about scope on this podcast, about something being way bigger and more complex than you could possibly conceive of. But remember, that doesn't necessarily have to be physical. There are many, many ways you could take that value. So, for example, you could have a whole cosmic horror story set in a room. Okay, I'll give an example. I think I'll give an example rather than try and explain it, because the example sets it up. There's a Junji Ito manga, and he's the guy who wrote sorry, I'm really hungover. I totally forgot the name of it. It's about spirals. I
don't know the name, but it's become a meme at this point.
Yeah. Anyway, he's like a fairly well-known horror writer in the West, not so much in Japan, weirdly. But he's got this story about these holes appearing in this cliff face, right? And all these people feel somehow drawn towards this cliff face, right? And when you get to the holes, you realize that each of these holes, they're a silhouette of a person. And all these people who are drawn to it realize slowly that each of these holes are for them, right? And it's just about them realizing, like, oh, I actually perfectly fit into that. And then sooner or later, they just start being drawn to go into these holes. And like they're literally exactly this. So they're just going into these things, and it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower. It's basically what I described in the early analogy. And it's just the way it finishes. I won't spoil it, but it's just,
yeah, it's messed up.
It's really messed up.
Yeah.
So that's, in terms of scope, that's not necessarily physically very large, but that concept is very unsettling. So I guess I'd say just be creative and don't limit yourself to one idea of what cosmic horror can be, because I think by its nature, it is incredibly broad and can be taken in a number of different ways. That's would be my tip, I'd say. Cool. And that is it for today. If you've liked this, we'd really appreciate if you could give us a review on Spotify or whatever podcast player you are listening to. So I'll just read out a quote for us now, just to send us off. This is by the man himself, H.P. Lovecraft, and he said, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." So with that, constant listener, we bid you adieu, and we'll see you on the next pod. This is Patty, James, and myself, Alex, and we'll see you around.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.